In 1947, a disturbing distress signal was sent out kind of in all directions, like a blind distress signal from some point in the Indian Ocean. Numerous American, Dutch, and English ships, along with other international listening stations, heard this distress signal. And once they triangulated where it was coming from, they sent out a search party to go see who needed help. When they arrived on scene, they discovered something that would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time. This is the story of the SS Orang Medan. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here. I was a Navy SEAL for a little while, and now I tell strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. YouTube is my new passion, and I'm going to be posting at least 2 times a week going forward. And if you like this kind of content, please right now hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this stuff. Thank you very much. Before we get into this story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the U.S. Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947, it's been 70 plus years, and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia, and with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Orang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Orang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Orang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Or you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Orang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. From the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Orang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So the Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad. but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away. They're all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared. It looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like, their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Orang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Orang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Orang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important to hear too. And then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Orang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Orang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Orang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's shipping registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Orang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Orang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed to these chemicals as soon as they got there? Either way, it's a fascinating story, and I hope that you took something from it. So if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you liked this video and you hit subscribe on my channel. I will be posting at least 2 times a week going forward, content just like this, so I hope you'll join, and that's gonna do it, guys. Thank you. There is nothing quite as satisfying as a true story that's mysterious and interesting, it sucked you in, that has a killer plot twist, a killer reveal. That, to me, is just the most satisfying thing you can find. I am a complete story addict, and so I go looking for these stories. I go literally searching for real-life stories with real-life plot twists. And in my opinion, the very best one is the story of the missing lighthouse keepers, and that is the story I'm going to tell today. So the too long didn't read version of this story is a crew is sent out to this lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. They're being sent out there to relieve the workers that are there, provide new supplies, and just kind of make sure everything is okay. When they get out there, nothing is okay. The 3 lighthouse keepers are missing. The island and the lighthouse are kind of in disarray. And then they find the lighthouse keeper's logbook, which, needless to say, is very strange. It has some entries in it that don't really add up. And then when you combine those entries with what some people had to say on the mainland that were watching the island, it really doesn't add up. So it creates this really epic plot twist. It's absolutely worth watching to the end, I promise. So let's get there. Off the coast of northwestern Scotland lies a stretch of 7 small islands. It's called the Flannan Isles. One of those isles is called Eilean Moor, and on Eilean Moor is a lighthouse, and that's where our story is going to be centered. But before we get into the story, Eilean Moor has some odd history to it. It's long been regarded as a place that's paranormal. In fact, on the island, basically the only people that inhabit it are the lighthouse keepers. Usually there's 3 or 4 of them, and sheep. And so sheep herders often go out to that island, and they're the ones that report hearing strange sounds and just feeling like they're being watched. It's a creepy place. And in fact, anybody that visits the island that isn't a sheep herder or a lighthouse keeper, even if they've never heard of the history of Eilean Moor, oftentimes report a very odd sense of being watched, of just not feeling right on that island. And so Eilean Moor really had developed a reputation as being a pretty creepy place. So in addition to just the strange aura around the island that basically anyone who went there reported, anybody that went to the Church of St. Flannan is its name, they reported feeling like they were being drawn to pray, that there was this overwhelming sense that you should be praying as soon as you walk into the church. And in fact, the draw was so strong, like getting on your knees and praying, that they developed this strange ritual that when you got to the island, it was customary that before you went in, you immediately dropped to your knees and crawled around the church on your knees before making your way inside and continuing to pray. So just a strange place with strange rituals. That's the scene that is set for this true life, very strange mystery. In December of 1900, a steamboat was passing by the Flannan Isles, and as they rounded their way past Eilean Moor, they noticed that the light was out. The lighthouse was not operational. And so when that steamboat finally got to port 3 days later, they told authorities that, hey, Eilean Moor is not operational. You should go check on them. And so as it happened, it was actually time to replace the lighthouse keepers that were at Eilean Moor. So Captain James Harvey gets his crew together, and he takes Joseph Moore, who's the replacement lighthouse keeper, and they head out to Eilean Moor to check on the lighthouse, check on the lighthouse keepers, but also replace them. So it was a changing of the guard and making sure that everything was okay. As you approach Eilean Moor, you would see a massive staircase coming up from the dock all the way up to where the lighthouse is. So from a distance, if you were looking at Eilean Moor, it would be fairly easy to break out anybody that was walking down the steps to get down to the dock. And since the island was really only inhabited by lighthouse keepers and sheep, the crew, Captain Harvey and his crew, as they're making their approach to Eilean Moor, they're watching those steps to see if the lighthouse keepers are going to notice them and come down and greet them on the dock, because that was customary. You always are at the dock ready to assist the crew as they come into Eilean Moor. That was just the way it was done. And so as they're making their approach, they're watching these steps, looking for signs that the keepers are coming down, because on some level, the crew that's going out to replace them, on the back of their head, they're a little bit nervous that something's wrong. I mean, they know that the lighthouse was not operational, and that's part of the reason they're going out. So they're kind of like actively watching those steps. They're looking for signs that they're coming down to the dock. And as they get closer and closer, they don't see anybody come down the steps. They don't see anyone on the dock. And even worse, no preparations were made for the next crew to come into the dock. That was something that all lighthouse keepers did. They kept that dock, up to codes that if any time someone came in, they could properly dock and make their way up. So no preparations are made. No one is coming down to greet them. So the omen is pretty bad. And so Captain Harvey and his crew, they dock on the dock, and the captain and his crew say, hey, to Joseph Moore, you go up and just do a cursory examination of the island. Make sure these guys are okay. We'll stay down here for a minute. You go check. So Joseph Moore gets out, and he starts walking up this massive set of stairs where he can't see the lighthouse. He can only see the steps. It's pretty steep. And later he would say that he had this deep sense of just foreboding, like something bad is about to happen. He felt very stressed out as he's walking up these stairs. And as he makes his way up, he finally kind of crests to where he can actually start to break out the top of the island, where you can see the lighthouse and you can see, where they were staying. And the first thing he notices is the steel railings that line this massive staircase up to the island near the lighthouse itself. The steel railings had been bent over. Like, imagine if it was made out of tinfoil. They had been folded onto themselves. Like, pretty significant damage to, steel railings. And so he makes note of that. And he also notices that this big boulder that just, I don't think it was decorative, it just was on the island, and so they built around it. There's this huge boulder that just was right in front of the lighthouse, and it had been that way for, years and years. It had moved significantly, and you could actually see a trail underneath the boulder where it had rolled across the grass. So Joseph Moore, the replacement lighthouse keeper, is thinking to himself, my God, this is straight out of the storm of the century. Like, clearly the worst storm ever has hit this island. No wonder their lighthouse was non-operational, because they were hit with like the worst storm ever. And so that's his initial assessment. He goes up to the door. The door is unlocked, but shut. And he opens it up. First thing he does is he yells for the lighthouse keepers that are supposed to be there. They don't call back. There's apparently no one in the lighthouse. Before he even starts moving through the lighthouse, he looks on his right and he sees all the hooks where they would have kept their clothes. And one hook still is holding an oilskin jacket. And anytime you would leave the lighthouse, especially if you were leaving the island for some reason, there is no reason in the world you would not be wearing that jacket. So it's another kind of bad sign. It means that if they're not here, if the 3 lighthouse keepers are not inside of this lighthouse, why aren't all 3 oilskins gone with them? It's another sign that something terrible has happened. He looks into the kitchen, and on the kitchen table is plates of meat, There is, pickles that have just been pulled out of a jar, and a couple of the chairs have been upturned. And he also noticed that the mechanical clocks had stopped. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, something happened where they left in a hurry because they toppled over chairs, they left food on the table, someone forgot their jacket. He continues moving through the lighthouse and he gets to their bedrooms, and all of their beds are unmade. Again, it was kind of customary that you would never leave the lighthouse unmade. You would make your bed because someone else could be coming in to relieve you. And so it was yet another sign to Joseph Moore that something had happened suddenly that caused the lighthouse keepers to abandon the lighthouse. Combining that with the massive damage from the storm, he's starting to think, something happened, this horrible storm is coming through. Like maybe it got really bad really quickly and they didn't have time to make proper preparations. They didn't have time to do the things that were customary. They just had to kind of boogie out of there. So Joseph Moore returns to Captain Harvey and says, "This is what I saw." And so Captain Harvey and the crew go back up and they kind of see it for themselves. And Captain Harvey ends up sending a telegram back to the mainland explaining that there has been a horrible tragedy here. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The three keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. After Captain Harvey sends this telegram, he and Joseph Moore and the rest of the crew continue to kind of search the island and do some investigating. And they discover the logbook that the three lighthouse keepers had been keeping. And so all of the entries are pretty standard. It was, common practice that you would mark down what happened that day, what ships you saw, just kind of basic log keeping of the lighthouse. But they start getting really interesting on December 12th. On December 12th, the leader of the three lighthouse keepers noted that severe winds, the likes of which he had never seen before, he's been doing this for decades, are passing through the island. And he's acting pretty worried about whether or not the lighthouse will be able to withstand this storm. He also noted that the other two lighthouse keepers were not doing well. He said one of them had been basically just praying nonstop. The other had been doing a bit of crying. Now, the man he's describing that is crying over the intensity of the storm was known on the mainland as one of the toughest, saltiest men on the planet, who had weathered dozens of hurricanes out on islands all by himself. And so for him to be crying over the severity of the storm just shows you how severe the storm really was. The entries on the 13th and 14th point to them believing that they're not going to get out of the storm alive. At this point, all three of them are just praying nonstop and are kind of anticipating at some point they're just going to get swept off the island. Then on December 15th, it just says, "Storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all." So Robert Moorhead, who is one of the leaders of the investigation, said that basically on December 15th, after that final entry was made, they must have gone down to the dock to secure some of the supplies and just kind of make sure that it wasn't totally damaged from all of the storm, and a rogue wave from this storm must have swept them away. When word got to the Scottish mainland about what had happened to these lighthouse keepers, the people that sat on the coast facing Eilean Moor, they were really confused, because whenever there's a storm out at Eilean Moor, they can see it because the island's not that far off the coast and they can see the storm. But over the past few days, namely December 12th to the 15th, which was the time period those log entries were made about the storm passing through, the people on the mainland of Scotland said that not only was there no storm, but in fact, the visibility onto Eilean Moor was better than it had been in years. They saw parts of the island that were only visible in perfect circumstances, meaning there was never any storm. So what the heck happened to those lighthouse keepers? What were those log entries about? Why were they drawn to tears? How did the railings get flipped over and the boulder get moved aside? Where did they go? In the years following their disappearance, other keepers were sent out to man that lighthouse, and all of them reported hearing someone yelling the names of the three lighthouse keepers that went missing. So pretty creepy stuff. And unfortunately, it's still very much an unsolved mystery, despite the official statement by Robert Moorhead. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think might have happened to the lighthouse keepers, and what could possibly explain that there wasn't a storm, but in the journal they said it was the worst storm ever, and there's physical damage done to the island. How do we reconcile that? Like, either someone's not telling the truth or something just doesn't add up. And I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. So if you haven't already, please like this video and hit subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Thank you all so much, and I'll talk to you soon. A 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setti's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had that begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm going to be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt, and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries, all from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet. So let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child, and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor, and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with the doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead, because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? But the doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place, and doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building, but she didn't know where it was, and she's 3-4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up, crying. because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden. It's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now. You live here. You've never lived anywhere else. Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, I'm home, I'm with my people. This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed as people are looking at them like, what's going on with your child? She finally leaves with her parents, but at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble, and in fact, they said, you can't come to Sunday school anymore. Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, that is my home. That's where I'm from, right there, Temple of Seti I. In Abydos, Egypt. That's my home. And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture. And she's like, that's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this? Like, she didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden, but she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answer her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, I'm home, I'm home. Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hor-Ra, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her, he couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hor-Ra was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was in fact about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hor-Ra, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story. And it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Eady, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben Trishit took her own life. Edie's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Eady anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple but the people who lived there, because it was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up a office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, if you dig here, you're going to find this garden. And sure enough, they dug down and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed. And once they dug it up, she was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it, and there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a secret underneath the temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, I mean, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. So that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this, please like the video and hit subscribe. I'm going to be posting multiple times a week stories about the strange, mysterious, dark stuff. If that's the kind of thing you like, then I'm the channel for you, I hope. Also, please follow me on TikTok. My handle is also MrBallen. And then on Instagram, it's JohnBallen416. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. See ya. Maritime history is full of unexplained phenomenon and tall tales of sea monsters and, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out on the water and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate, if you could gently liquidate, I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button, if you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him. And he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans kind of that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku, because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had, and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians, and in time, he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that would be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and 4 of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful, so they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat, so they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it, and so they got their boat, they went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught, and they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen and anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui-Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep. There's very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon, and so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel, and it eventually turned into a full-scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this East Coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging. Gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, They said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku, they knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There's a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he is in a crazy twist of fate, 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarah Joe, and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it. And it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of things that could have to do with the Sarah Joe crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Mormon. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Mormon had been found, the family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarah Joe, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so this team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarah Joe, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Mormon was buried, but those bones also belong to Scott Mormon. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Mormon, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used.
Evet, belki kolay değil başarı. İnancını yitirmek ki başarasın. Yeter ki her dağı aşalım. Yeter ki her dağı aşalım. Neler çektiğini bilmez konuşur alayı. Neler çektiğimizi bilmez konuşur alayı. Sorun değil inan, disiplinle devam. Çektiğin her cefa sürülür sefa. Sonrasında ailenizin gururu olmak için çabaya devam. Aslan kardeşler hadi çabalamaya devam. Yolun sonuna kadar inan. Bana değecek tüm bu olanlara değecek.
While it was a very big deal that they located Scott Mormon's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later, this is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Mormon's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like who buried Scott Mormon? How did Scott Mormon become freshly buried almost a decade later? How long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask, but there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile, and that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those the little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it, just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had the Sarah Joe, the crew of the Sarah Joe, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark. So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to, they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, they just after the survey's done, let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Moorman? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Moorman, well, then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comments section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap. How can we account for those 6 years when they were not at the Taongi Atoll? I mean, my suggestion would be maybe the survey wasn't done very well and they just missed it. But that still doesn't also answer, well, who buried Scott Moorman? And also, why were his bones not so bleached? How did he come to be freshly buried 9.5 years after he disappeared? So lots of questions. I would love to hear your theories, your comments, your takeaways in the comments section. And again, if you liked this video, please hit like, please click subscribe, turn on all notifications, because I'm going to be posting stories like this one 3-4 times a week. I love doing this, and I hope you'll come along. If you want to follow me on other social media channels, my handle on Instagram is JohnBallen416, and I am MrBallen, one word, on every other social media platform. I post quite a bit on TikTok, so you can check me out over there. That's going to do it, guys. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to reading your comments. See ya.